"Oh, great, the old man's here." I heard those words echo across the marble lobby of Pinnacle Investments as I walked through the glass doors. My son-in-law Evan didn't bother lowering his voice. He wanted everyone to hear him dismiss me. The receptionist looked up from her desk, uncomfortable. Two junior brokers by the water cooler turned to watch. I could feel the weight of their stares as I approached Evan's desk in the open office area. "Harold," Evan said, not standing, not offering his hand. "You're early." I wasn't early. I was exactly on time for our 2 p.m. appointment, but Evan needed to establish control from the first moment. He gestured toward a chair across from his desk like he was doing me a favor. The fabric was expensive, but the position was calculated, lower than his chair, facing the light so I'd have to squint while he remained comfortable in shadow. "So," Evan said, shuffling papers without looking at me, "Linda says you need some help with your finances." The way he said it made it sound like charity. "Actually," he continued, pulling out a thick folder, "your daughter already approved this consultation. She's worried about some compliance issues with your accounts." "Compliance issues? Nothing serious? Yet?" He glanced around the office, lowering his voice. "But if we don't get your paperwork updated today, your accounts could be flagged for review. Frozen, potentially." "This isn't really optional," Evan added, sliding papers toward me. "We do this with clients like you all the time. Trust me, you don't want to deal with federal scrutiny at your age." He tapped a pen against his desk. "There's already a note on your file about irregular account activity. I'm trying to keep this internal. We need to clear that up today." I watched him perform for his colleagues. The condescending tone, the theatrical sighs, the way he made sure everyone could see him managing the difficult relative. A woman at the desk behind him covered her mouth, trying not to smile. Two men by the coffee station whispered to each other, glancing in our direction. "Sit down," Evan said, not looking up from his papers. "Take your time reading," he added when I hesitated, "but not too much time." "Questions?" he asked after sliding the documents toward me. "Just one," I said. "Can I think about this?" "Think fast," Evan replied. "Compliance doesn't wait." I could feel people watching, not helping, just watching. Some of you know exactly what this feels like. By the way, please give me just 10 seconds of your time. If you enjoy stories like this, liking the video and subscribing is enough. I'll wait. Now, let me continue where I left off. I sat there for 23 minutes while Evan explained why a retired high school teacher couldn't possibly understand modern portfolio theory or algorithmic trading strategies. 23 minutes of condescension disguised as education. But part of me wondered if he was right. Maybe I was too old-fashioned. Maybe my simple buy-and-hold strategy really was outdated. The market had changed so much since I'd started investing. For a moment, I doubted myself. I didn't speak. I listened to every word, cataloged every claim, tried to understand if there was truth in his warnings about compliance and federal scrutiny. I didn't react. I remembered everything. The uncertainty sat heavy in my chest. What if Evan really was trying to help? What if my defensive reaction was just pride talking? "The thing about guys like you," Evan said, leaning forward, "is you're too conservative. Scared money doesn't make money. Your daughter doesn't want to deal with this stress," he continued. "She asked me to handle everything so you wouldn't have to worry about compliance deadlines." He pulled up a chart on his computer screen, angling it toward me. "See? What I can do for you is move your money into protected positions before the review hits. This is for your own good." "We've guided hundreds of retirees through this process," Evan said, his voice taking on an urgent edge. "The ones who wait too long? Well, let's just say the government doesn't give second chances. Boring stuff. Like the investments that had been paying my bills for years. But what caught my attention wasn't his sales pitch. It was something smaller. I wasn't sure he was wrong yet. I was sure he was rushing me. The business card holder on his desk was empty. In a firm like this, successful brokers kept their cards prominently displayed. It was a status symbol, a way to announce your importance to anyone who visited your desk. Evan's holder was empty because he didn't have clients important enough to impress. At the time, it felt harmless, just a detail, a small sign that my son-in-law might not be the investment prodigy he claimed to be. But I filed it away anyway, along with everything else I was learning about the man who'd married my daughter. "What I need from you," Evan said, pulling out a folder of papers, "is to consolidate your accounts immediately. Transfer everything to Pinnacle so we can protect it from the compliance review." The papers were already filled out. My name, Linda's address, even details about accounts he shouldn't have known about. "These authorize us to act on your behalf during the risk review," he said, sliding them across the desk. "Once you sign, We can protect your assets from regulatory holds and verification delays. I picked up the first page. The language was dense, technical, threatening. Words like irrevocable authorization and emergency asset protection. My assistant can notarize these right now, Evan said, but we need to move fast. After 5 p.m. today, your accounts could be flagged for restriction. If I signed these papers, I realized, Evan would have complete control over my financial life. Every account, every decision, every penny would flow through him, and getting that control back would be nearly impossible. She was already walking over with her stamp, Evan said, gesturing toward the woman who'd been watching our conversation. Save you a trip. Everything was convenient, too convenient. Forms ready, notary available, pressure to sign immediately. If you know, you know. The assistant approached our desk with her stamp and seal. She'd done this before, probably many times. Her smile was practiced, professional, designed to make elderly clients feel comfortable about signing documents they didn't fully understand. But I wasn't any elderly client. I was a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years reading contracts, memorizing details, and catching the mistakes other people missed. I'd reviewed purchase agreements, insurance policies, and investment prospectuses until I could spot problems in my sleep. And these documents had problems. The power of attorney was dated 3 days from now, a small thing, the kind of detail most people wouldn't notice. But I'd spent my career grading papers, catching errors, noticing what didn't belong. You don't backdate legal documents unless you're planning to use them before your client expects you to have them. This date is wrong, I said quietly, pointing to the line. Evan glanced at the paper, and for just a moment, his confidence flickered. Oh, that's just... The notary probably predated it. Happens all the time. We'll fix it. But his assistant was already reaching for the document, ready to make the correction. Too quickly, too smoothly. They'd made this mistake before and knew exactly how to handle it. That single detail changed everything, because now I knew this wasn't incompetence. It wasn't a young broker trying to help his father-in-law. This was a system, a process they'd refined with other clients who hadn't been paying attention. I smiled and nodded, playing the part of the confused old man who'd caught an innocent error. But inside, I was cataloging everything. The predated forms, the assistant's rehearsed responses, the way Evan had personal financial information he shouldn't have possessed. I'd walked into this office thinking I was humoring my son-in-law's ambitions. Instead, I'd discovered something that was going to require a different kind of response entirely. I didn't sign anything that day. Told Evan I needed to think it over and discuss it with Linda. He didn't like that, but he couldn't push too hard without revealing his urgency. The drive home was quiet, but my mind was racing. I'd walked into that office expecting a routine conversation about retirement planning. Instead, I'd discovered something that made my teacher's instincts kick into high alert. That evening, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Richard, the attorney who'd handled my estate planning for 15 years. Richard had represented teachers and public employees for most of his career. He knew the games people played with retirees who looked vulnerable. Harold, Richard said after I'd finished describing the documents Evan had shown me, what you're describing sounds like a pattern. The predated authorizations, the pressure to sign immediately, the research into accounts you didn't authorize. How long has this been going on? Today was the first time I've seen the paperwork, but I think the planning started months ago. We need to document everything. Can you remember exactly what those forms said? I could. 35 years of teaching had trained my memory for details. I recited the key phrases, the legal language, the specific clauses that had caught my attention. The second call was to Margaret Sullivan, my financial advisor for the past 20 years. Margaret managed portfolios for a dozen retired teachers. She'd seen every scam, every pressure tactic, every sophisticated theft disguised as financial planning. I'll check everything, she said when I explained my concerns. But Harold, if someone's been fishing for your account details, we need to document it. This could be bigger than just you. What do you mean? I mean you might not be the first elderly client Evan has targeted. The third call was the hardest one. Dad, Evan's just trying to help, Linda said when I expressed my concerns about the documents. He explained the whole compliance situation. You could lose everything if you don't let him protect your accounts. Linda, I don't think there is a compliance situation. Dad, you're not thinking clearly about this. Evan knows the financial industry. You're a retired teacher. Why won't you trust him? Her voice carried a frustration I'd never heard before, like I was being deliberately difficult. He spent hours researching your situation. Do you know how many elderly people lose their savings because they're too stubborn to accept professional help? It's embarrassing, Dad. Evan just wants to help. She couldn't hear what I was hearing, couldn't see what I was seeing. Because when you love someone, you want to believe the best about them, even when the evidence suggests you shouldn't. I'm sure you're right, I said, not wanting to worry her. I just want to be careful. But I was being more than careful. I was being strategic. Quiet people prepare louder than they speak. Over the next 2 weeks, I gathered information like I was preparing for the most important lesson plan of my career. Richard confirmed that the documents I'd been shown were designed to transfer control of my assets with minimal oversight. But what Evan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd lived through market crashes and financial panics. I'd seen fear used as a weapon before. I knew the difference between genuine warning and manufactured urgency. He wasn't warning me about compliance issues. He was rushing me toward a signature, that everything he'd been explaining to me, I'd already been doing successfully for decades. Margaret discovered 3 unauthorized credit checks on my accounts, all traced back to Evan's firm. Someone had been researching my financial situation without my knowledge or consent. But the most disturbing discovery came when I researched Pinnacle Investments itself. I spent hours in the public library, using their computers to search through complaint databases and regulatory filings. What I found was a pattern of targeting retirees with complex family financial situations, elderly clients who'd been pressured into signing documents they didn't understand, families torn apart by disputes over money management. Evan wasn't working alone. He was part of a system. I didn't confront anyone, didn't make accusations, didn't even tell Linda what I was learning. I just collected evidence and prepared for what I knew was coming. Because predators don't stop when their first attempt fails. They escalate. Evan called me 4 times in 3 days. Harold, I haven't heard back about those documents. The market's moving fast right now. We need to get your money positioned before you miss out. Each call was more urgent than the last. More pressure, more warnings about missed opportunities and market timing. But pressure creates cracks, and when people are desperate, they make mistakes. The 4th call came on a Friday evening while Linda was visiting. She answered my phone without thinking. Dad's phone, she said cheerfully. I could hear Evan's voice from across the room, angry, frustrated, not the patient professional he pretended to be during our meetings. He needs to stop playing games and sign those papers. I've got quotas to meet, and I can't wait around for him to make up his mind. Linda's face changed as she listened. She was hearing something she'd never heard before. The real Evan. The one who talked about her father like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be helped. I'll tell him you called, she said quietly and hung up. She looked at me for a long moment, pieces clicking into place. Dad, she said finally, what exactly is Evan asking you to sign? I sat in my study that night, looking through 40 years of investment statements. Blue chip stocks bought with my first teaching paycheck. Mutual funds purchased month after month, regardless of market conditions. Bonds accumulated during nervous times. REITs added when I learned about diversification. All of it built slowly, patiently, without drama or sophisticated strategies. The documents were spread across my desk like evidence in a courtroom. Account statements showing steady growth. Tax returns documenting conservative but consistent gains. Bank records proving I'd never needed anyone else's help to manage my money. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was my son-in-law, the investment professional, trying to convince me I needed his expertise, while I sat surrounded by evidence that I'd been doing just fine without him for decades. But this wasn't really about money, was it? This was about respect. About a young man who couldn't see value in anything he didn't control. About a father being dismissed by someone who'd never bothered to ask what he might already know. I thought about Linda, about the choice she was going to have to make when she learned the truth about her husband, about the grandchildren I might never see if this went badly, about the family dinners that would become impossible, the holidays that would turn into battlefields. But some principles matter more than comfort. Some lines can't be crossed without consequences. I'd taught high school for 35 years. I'd seen what happened when you let bullies get away with their behavior. They didn't stop. They escalated, and they found new victims. The clock on my desk showed 11:47 p.m. In 14 hours, I would sit across from Evan again, but this time, the conversation would be different. This time, I wouldn't be the confused old man he expected me to be. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on Tuesday. Evan's office, just like before, but this time I brought my attorney with me. The lobby felt different when you walked in with purpose instead of uncertainty. The marble floors, the expensive artwork, the whispered conversations of brokers making deals, all of it seemed smaller somehow, less intimidating. Evan was waiting at his desk, papers arranged in neat stacks, confidence radiating from his posture, until he saw the attorney walking beside me. "Harold," Evan said, standing halfway up before settling back into his chair. "I thought this was just going to be us. My attorney is here to help me understand the legal implications of what you're proposing." Before Evan could respond, a tall man in an expensive suit approached our area. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to. "I'm William, Compliance Director. I happened to overhear your name, Mr. Harold," I said quietly. His expression changed immediately. "Harold, you wouldn't happen to be my old physics teacher?" Evan's face went pale. "Yes," I said quietly. "That was me." "My God," William said, extending his hand. "You taught me physics at Roosevelt High in 1978. Billy, third row, middle seat. Later, I took your evening class at the community college, basic business law. You changed my life." I watched Evan realize that his confused old teacher had taught the compliance director of the firm where he worked. William turned to Evan, his voice carrying new authority. "Evan, why didn't you tell me who this was?" I watched Evan's face change, the smooth confidence replaced by something harder, more calculating, the mask slipping just enough to show what was underneath. "There's nothing complicated about it," he said, gesturing toward the papers on his desk. "Just some basic account management agreements, standard industry forms." Richard opened his briefcase and pulled out copies of the documents Evan had shown me 2 weeks earlier. But these copies had notes in the margins, highlighted sections, legal analysis that revealed exactly what those basic agreements would have accomplished. "These documents," Richard said calmly, placing them on Evan's desk, "would give Mr. Evan broad discretionary authority over Mr. Harold's assets. They're designed to be difficult to revoke and would allow significant latitude in investment decisions without client oversight." "That's standard language," Evan protested, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "All investment firms use similar forms." "No," Richard said, pulling out a second folder. "They don't. I've reviewed agreements from 12 major firms in this city. None of them contain these specific provisions. None of them require such broad authority for routine account management." I watched Evan realize that his confused old teacher had been more thorough than he'd expected, that the man he'd dismissed as naive had outmaneuvered him completely. "I taught high school physics for 35 years, I said quietly. William's eyes flicked to Evan. He understood what I meant. "But after school I taught basic business law at the community college, evening classes, contracts, financial documents, how to read the fine print. I've seen every trick in the book." His face went pale. "You forgot who taught me," I continued, looking at William. "My father was a bank examiner. He taught me to read financial documents before I could read comic books, showed me how people hide their intentions in legal language." The truth was simpler than Evan had imagined and more damning than he'd feared. The complaint to the SEC was filed on Wednesday, the report to Pinnacle's compliance department on Thursday, the detailed documentation to the state attorney general's office on Friday. By the following Monday, Evan was no longer employed by Pinnacle Investments. Compliance opened a formal case. His license was suspended pending review. No firm would touch him after that. Linda divorced him 8 months later. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said when the papers were final. "I should have seen what he was doing to both of us. Evan lost everything. The house, the car, access to their accounts. Linda's testimony about his psychological manipulation sealed his fate. Today, his name still circulates as a warning in compliance training programs. You loved him," I said. "There's no shame in that. There's only shame in what he tried to do. How did you know? How did you see what I couldn't?" "Experience," I said. 40 years of reading people, of seeing how they behave when they think no one important is watching. But there was shame in what he'd tried to do. To me, to the other elderly clients who might not have been as prepared to defend themselves, to the families he was willing to destroy in pursuit of money that wasn't his. Today I still manage my own investments, still live in the same house, still have coffee with Richard once a month to review my estate planning and discuss the cases he's working on. But now I also volunteer with the state's Elder Protection Services, helping other retirees understand what to watch for, how to protect themselves from financial predators. Because the truth about people like Evan is simple. They're not sophisticated. They're just betting that their victims won't know enough to stop them, and sometimes they're wrong. Justice doesn't shout, it just waits. Some of us are older, but we're not blind.